When we think about the wives of the Nazi leadership, a pattern emerges almost immediately. These were women who, for the most part, survived. They outlived their husbands, outlived the regime, and outlived the war itself. Some of them were interned for a time, had their assets stripped, or faced brief periods of social shame. But they went on. Ilse Hess lived to 1995. Margarete Himmler made it to 1967. Lina Heydrich survived until 1985. Emmy Göring died peacefully in Munich in 1973. The wives of the Nazi inner circle, almost without exception, had the chance to mourn, to grow old, to decide what version of themselves they would present to the post-war world. Magda Goebbels had no such chance. She did not face a denazification tribunal. She did not give interviews defending her husband decades later. She did not write a carefully worded memoir. On the night of May 1st, 1945, inside the Führerbunker in Berlin, while Soviet forces tightened their ring around the city, Magda Goebbels killed her 6 children, one by one, and then took her own life. She was 43 years old. That act, that singular, devastating act, is what separates her from every other woman who stood near the center of the Third Reich. And it is the act that makes her both the most fascinating and perhaps the most disturbing figure in the entire gallery of Nazi wives. Because Magda Goebbels was not a simple person. She was not merely a monster, though the murder of her children was monstrous. She was not merely a victim, though elements of her life invite that reading. She was a woman of genuine intelligence, of unmistakable charisma, of deep political conviction and, by every account, considerable personal warmth, who nonetheless arrived at the most horrifying decision a mother can make. How? Why? What made Magda Goebbels the woman she became, and what brought her to that bunker, to those children, to that night? In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Magda Goebbels was born Johanna Maria Magdalena Behrendt on November 11, 1901 in Berlin. The circumstances of her birth were themselves complicated, a sign perhaps of the complexity that would define her entire life. Her mother, Augusta Behrendt, was unmarried at the time of Magda's birth, a fact that carried considerable social stigma in Wilhelmina, Germany. Her biological father was Oskar Ritschl, an engineer of some means, and though he would later play a role in her life, he was not present in any meaningful sense during her early childhood. Augusta Behrendt subsequently married a Belgian businessman named Richard Friedlander, and it was his surname that Magda carried through much of her early life. Friedlander was Jewish, and this fact would later become one of the more charged biographical footnotes in the story of a woman who ended up at the very heart of the most virulently anti-Semitic regime in history. The family moved to Brussels for a period, and Magda received part of her early education at a Catholic convent school there, the Institut du Sacré-Cœur. It was a cosmopolitan upbringing for the early 20th century, shaped by travel, by changing social circumstances, by a mother who was resourceful and determined, and by a stepfather who provided financial stability, even as his presence in Magda's life was sometimes intermittent. By the time the First World War began, Magda was a young teenager, and the chaos of the war years reshaped her family's situation as it reshaped so many others across Europe. She returned to Germany and continued her education, ultimately attending the Holzhausen School in Göttingen, where she demonstrated the kind of intellectual sharpness that would mark her throughout her life. It was during her time in Göttingen that Magda had what may have been the first truly formative romantic experience of her life. She fell in love with a young man named Viktor Alosarov, who was Jewish and who was already developing the Zionist convictions that would eventually take him to Palestine, where he would become a major figure in the Jewish labor movement. Their relationship was serious enough that for a time marriage was genuinely contemplated, but the relationship ended, the reasons never entirely clear from the historical record, and Magda's life moved in a different direction. Viktor Alosarov would go on to become one of the leaders of the Jewish Agency and would be assassinated in Tel Aviv in 1933 under circumstances that have never been definitively resolved. That Magda Goebbels, the future embodiment of the Nazi ideal of German womanhood, once came close to marrying a prominent Jewish Zionist is one of the stranger and more haunting footnotes in the history of the Third Reich. After her schooling, Magda returned to Berlin, and in 1921, at the age of 19, she married Günther Quandt. The marriage to Quandt was in almost every respect a practical arrangement dressed up in the language of romance. Quandt was 20 years her senior, a wealthy industrialist whose business interests spanned textiles, chemicals, and what would later become a vast manufacturing empire. He was not, by any account, a particularly warm or emotionally available husband. He was driven, successful, and entirely focused on his business concerns, which meant that Magda, installed in luxury but frequently alone, found the marriage wanting almost from the start. She and Quandt had one son together, Harold, born in 1921, and Magda also became stepmother to Quandt's sons from his first marriage. But the emotional distance between husband and wife grew steadily wider, and by the mid-1920s the marriage was effectively over in all but legal terms. The divorce from Quandt was finalised in 1929, and Magda received a generous financial settlement that left her well positioned for an independent life. She was 27, attractive, socially confident, financially secure, and possessed of the kind of restless intelligence that required engagement with something larger than domestic routine. She had her son, she had her freedom, and Germany in 1929 was a country in political ferment, its Weimar democracy straining under the combined pressures of economic catastrophe and ideological extremism. Magda was looking for something to believe in. What she found was National Socialism. The precise moment of Magda's conversion to Nazism is difficult to pin down exactly, but by 1930 she had attended several Nazi party rallies and meetings in Berlin, and had been drawn in by the energy and the ideological certainty she encountered there. The movement offered what her marriage to Quandt had not, a sense of purpose, of historical mission, of belonging to something that mattered. It was at one of these party gatherings that she encountered Joseph Goebbels. He was then the Gauleiter of Berlin, the Nazi Party's chief propagandist in the capital, a man of extraordinary rhetorical gifts and equally extraordinary personal vanity. He was short, physically slight, plagued by a clubfoot that had kept him out of military service in the First World War, and he had compensated for these insecurities with an intellect that was genuinely formidable and a tongue that could move crowds to rage or tears with equal facility. By every account, the attraction between Magda and Goebbels was immediate and intense. Goebbels, who kept a meticulous diary throughout his adult life, noted Magda's presence with mounting excitement almost from their first meeting. She was, he wrote, a woman of exceptional intelligence and beauty, the kind of woman he had always imagined beside him. For Magda, Goebbels represented something different from Quandt. He was electric, committed, living at the centre of history in the making. The fact that he was physically unimpressive, that he lacked the conventional masculine presence of a Günther Quandt, seems not to have diminished her attraction to him. What drew her was his mind, his passion, and, it must be said, his power, which was growing rapidly as the Nazi Party surged toward its eventual seizure of the German state. Their relationship developed quickly, though not without complications. Goebbels was not, to put it mildly, a faithful man. He was chronically unfaithful throughout his life, conducting affairs with a series of actresses and other women, even as he pursued Magda. And Magda, for her part, was not naive about this. She was a sophisticated woman who had already survived one failed marriage. She entered her relationship with Goebbels with full awareness of the kind of man he was. Why she proceeded nonetheless is one of the central questions of her biography. Part of the answer lies in ambition. Magda was not simply choosing a husband, she was choosing a role. By the time she and Goebbels became seriously involved in 1931, it was clear that the Nazi Party was likely to achieve national power within the foreseeable future. Adolf Hitler had personally taken notice of Magda, and he was enthusiastic about her relationship with his chief propagandist. When Magda and Goebbels married in December 1931, Hitler himself attended the ceremony, serving as a witness. That was not merely symbolic. Hitler had essentially endorsed the marriage, and with it, Magda's role as a symbol of the Nazi ideal. She would be, in Hitler's conception, the First Lady of the Third Reich in waiting, the perfect embodiment of the movement's vision of German womanhood. What did that vision entail? In the Nazi ideology, the ideal German woman was a mother above all else. She was to provide the race with children, to maintain the home as a sanctuary of Aryan values, to stand as a moral and biological foundation for the national community. She was not to compete with men in the public sphere, not to pursue a professional career, not to define herself in terms other than her domestic and reproductive role. The irony, of course, was that Magda Goebbels was almost precisely the opposite of this ideal in her actual character and intellect. She was highly educated, politically engaged, intellectually ambitious, and deeply interested in the public dimensions of the Nazi project. She spoke multiple languages. She had run her own social life with considerable strategic sophistication. She was, in the private estimation of many who knew her, substantially more intelligent than her husband. But she played the role assigned to her with total commitment. She gave speeches about German motherhood. She appeared at Nazi party functions as the perfect domestic goddess. She had 6 children with Goebbels in rapid succession. Helga, born in 1932. Hildegard, known as Hilde, born in 1934. Helmut, born in 1935. Holdine, known as Holder, born in 1937, Hedwig, known as Hedda, born in 1938, and Heide, born in 1940. All 6 names beginning with the letter H, in what was widely understood to be a tribute to Adolf Hitler. 7 children in total if you count Harold, her son from the Quandt marriage, though Harold lived primarily with his father and spent much of the war in military service, rather than with the Goebbels household. 6 children with Goebbels. 6 children who would die with her in the bunker. The early years of the Nazi regime from 1933 onward were in certain material respects the apex of Magda's public life. Joseph Goebbels was appointed Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, one of the most powerful positions in the new government. The Goebbels family occupied a grand official residence on the Hermann Göring Strasse in Berlin, as well as a country estate on the Bogensee Lake north of the capital. Magda presided over these establishments with the efficiency and style that came naturally to her. She was a gifted hostess. She entertained foreign dignitaries, filmmakers, artists, journalists. She charmed visitors from abroad who came away with impressions of Nazi Germany, shaped partly by the elegance and apparent normality of the Goebbels household. She was also, during this period, deeply involved in the regime's cultural ambitions. The film industry in particular fell within the propaganda ministry's orbit, which meant that Magda, as the minister's wife, had ongoing contact with the German film world. She had opinions on aesthetic matters. She was not simply a decorative presence. Visitors who underestimated her because of her domestic role often left surprised by the sharpness of her mind and the directness of her views. But the marriage itself was from very early on a misery. Goebbels' infidelities were not merely occasional lapses, they were continuous, and many of them were semi-public affairs with women of some prominence. The most famous and most serious of these was his relationship with the Czech actress Lida Bárová, which began in 1936 and which became so consuming that by 1938, Goebbels was apparently prepared to leave Magda for her. He requested a divorce from Hitler, who was furious. Hitler refused to permit the breakup of what had become a key piece of Nazi public imagery. The Goebbels marriage, with its photographed family scenes and its 6 photogenic children, was propaganda in and of itself. Hitler ordered the affair ended, commanded Bárová to leave Germany, and insisted that Goebbels remain with Magda. Magda had, in the meantime, become involved with a senior government official of her own, Karl Hanke, who was then serving as Goebbels' state secretary. The Hanke affair was, by Magda's own account to intimates, at least partly a response to her husband's sustained infidelities. It was also potentially a genuine emotional connection, the kind she had not found with Goebbels for years. Hanke was reportedly deeply in love with her and pleaded with her to leave Goebbels. But she did not. She remained in the marriage. Again, the question why has occupied historians and biographers for decades. The most compelling answer is that Magda's commitment to the Nazi project itself was simply stronger than any personal consideration. She had found her identity in National Socialism. She believed in it with a fervour that went beyond her relationship with any individual man, including her husband. Hitler had become, for her, something that transcended even romantic attachment. Contemporary observers and later historians have noted that Magda's feelings about Hitler were of an intensity that is difficult to categorize simply as political loyalty. She was devoted to him in a way that bordered on the religious. When she wrote to him in the final days of the war, explaining why she intended to take her children's lives and her own rather than survive the collapse of the regime, she described a world without National Socialism as simply unlivable. Not merely undesirable, unlivable. That conviction, that absolute identification between herself and the Nazi project, is what makes Magda Goebbels so different from the other wives of the Nazi leadership. Ilse Hess, Margarete Himmler, Emmy Göring. These women were attached to their husbands and, to varying degrees, to the ideology their husbands served. but their attachment was not ultimately so complete as to be indistinguishable from their sense of self. When the regime fell, they adapted, however grudgingly, to the world that remained. Magda could not or would not do this. For her, the Reich and its survival were not separable from the meaning of her own existence. To understand how she arrived at that conviction, you have to understand the relationship she built with Hitler himself across the 12 years of the Nazi regime. It was a relationship of unusual intimacy and unusual complexity. Hitler, as is well documented, had no conventional domestic life of his own during most of the Nazi period. His relationship with Eva Braun was kept almost entirely secret from the German public. What the public saw instead was the Goebbels family. Joseph, the brilliant propagandist, Magda, the ideal mother, and their growing cohort of blonde children. This family was, in a real sense, the public face of the regime's domestic vision, and Hitler valued that image enormously. But his relationship with Magda went beyond the merely instrumental. He trusted her judgment. He sought her opinion on matters of aesthetics and occasionally of policy. He spent time in the Goebbels household, attended family occasions, was photographed with the children. He called her his most valued and trusted friend among women. For Magda, this access to Hitler, this sense of being genuinely seen and valued by the man she regarded as the most significant figure in human history, was intoxicating. It compensated, at least partially, for the emotional inadequacies of her actual marriage. The war years changed the texture of Magda's life dramatically. The propaganda ministry kept Goebbels at the center of events, and he became in some respects more powerful as the war went on. After the German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, it was Goebbels who delivered the famous speech at the Berlin Sportpalast, asking the German people whether they wanted total war. The crowd's roar of assent is one of the most chilling moments in the documentary record of the Third Reich. Goebbels was in his element. He thrived on catastrophe. He thrived on crisis. His energy, his rhetorical force, his tactical genius for manipulation all found their fullest expression as the situation grew more desperate. For Magda, the war years were characterized by a different kind of pressure. She managed the family, supervised the children's upbringing, maintained the social obligations of her position, and dealt with the continuing reality of a marriage that was held together by external force and shared ideology rather than by any genuine warmth between the spouses. She also dealt with the mounting evidence of the regime's crimes. How much Magda Goebbels knew about the Holocaust is a question that historians have grappled with seriously. Given her proximity to the highest levels of the regime, given the company she kept and the conversations she was party to, the answer is almost certainly considerably more than she ever acknowledged, and possibly a great deal. The Jewish dimension of her biography adds a particular layer of complexity to this question. Her stepfather, Richard Friedländer, was Jewish. He had been interned by the Nazis. In 1939, he was sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp, and in 1939, while Magda was the wife of the Reich Minister of Propaganda, Richard Friedländer died in Nazi captivity. The exact circumstances of his death remain somewhat unclear, and there is no record of Magda making any serious effort to intervene on his behalf before or after his detention. This is one of the darker facts in a biography that contains many dark facts. The man who had provided her with a childhood home, who had given her his name for years, died in a system that her husband helped build and that she publicly championed. By 1944, as the military situation deteriorated catastrophically on all fronts, and as Allied bombers began reducing German cities to rubble, the question of what would happen when Germany lost was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. The women around the Nazi leadership began, with varying degrees of urgency, to make practical plans. Some cached valuables, some arranged for documents, some made contact with networks that might help them escape or survive. Magda Goebbels, by all available evidence, made no such arrangements. She had arrived at a different destination. The evidence for this comes not only from what she did in the end, but from what she said in the months leading up to it. She told her friend Elo Quandt, her former sister-in-law, that she would not survive the regime. She told others the same thing. She spoke of it as a settled matter rather than a dramatic declaration. She was not performing. She was stating what had become, for her, a simple fact. She was not going to live in a Germany that had been defeated, occupied and restructured by her enemies, and she was not going to leave her children to face that world either. That last conviction is the one that raises the most difficult questions. The decision to include the children in her death was not made in a moment of panic or madness, though one could argue that the state of mind that produced it was itself a form of madness. It was a decision she had apparently been moving toward for months. She had spoken of it in oblique terms that became less oblique as the Reich collapsed, and in the end she carried it out with a terrible methodical precision. The question of what Goebbels himself knew and sanctioned is complicated. His diary entries from the final period suggest that he and Magda were in agreement about not surviving the war. He wrote with a kind of grim satisfaction about dying alongside Hitler, about providing the final propaganda gesture of a regime that had always been, at its core, a theatre of death. Whether he specifically discussed the children's fate with Magda in explicit terms, or whether he simply left that to her, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that he did not prevent it. In the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces approached Berlin and the German state imploded around them, the Goebbels family moved into the Führerbunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. This was Magda's decision as much as her husband's. She had been offered an opportunity to leave Berlin, to take the children to safety in Bavaria or elsewhere. She declined. She insisted on remaining. The children, who ranged in age from 4-year-old Heide to 13-year-old Helga, were brought into the bunker with her. Life in the bunker in those final weeks is documented from several sources: the testimony of bunker survivors, the diaries and recollections of those who passed through, and a handful of letters that Magda wrote during that period. The picture that emerges is of a woman who had made her decision and was living in the full knowledge of what she intended to do, but who was not, in the observation of those around her, visibly unhinged or hysterical. She was composed. She was attentive to the children, who were in the bunker largely unaware of the magnitude of what was happening. She played games with them. She brushed their hair. She supervised their lessons in the strange underground half-life of the collapsing state. And she was preparing herself for what she had decided she would do. She wrote a letter to her son Harold, who was then a prisoner of war. Harold was her one child who would survive the war, the one from her quant marriage who was not in the bunker with her. The letter is one of the most striking documents of the Third Reich's final days. In it, Magda wrote that the world that would come after National Socialism was a world not worth living in, and that she had decided the children should not be brought up in that world. She expressed no doubt, no ambivalence, no wavering. She was calm and certain, in the manner of someone who has worked through a decision until it became simply a fact. She asked Harold to understand, to forgive her if forgiveness was needed, and to carry forward the values she had tried to instill in him. On May 1st, 1945, the day after Hitler took his own life, Magda Goebbels administered a sedative to her 6 children. When they were sleeping, she, along with the SS dentist Helmut Kunz, administered cyanide to each child. The question of whether Magda or Kunz or both administered the poison has been a matter of some historical debate. Kunz later claimed that he had injected the children with morphine at Magda's request to sedate them, and that he had refused to give them the final poison himself, leaving that act to Magda. Other accounts suggest the sequence may have been slightly different. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Helga, age 13. Hilda, age 12. Helmut, age 10. Holder, aged 8. Hedda, age 6. Heide, age 4. All 6 children were dead. Shortly thereafter, Magda and Joseph Goebbels went up to the Chancellery Garden. There, on the evening of May 1st, 1945, they died. The exact manner of their deaths has been subject to varying accounts over the years. The most widely accepted version holds that they each bit down on a cyanide capsule and that Joseph Goebbels was then shot by an SS orderly, either at his own request or by pre-arrangement to ensure death. Their bodies were partially burned but not destroyed and were found by Soviet troops in the days that followed. Joseph Goebbels was 47 years old. Magda Goebbels was 43. And on that night in Berlin, in the ruins of the regime they had both served with absolute commitment, they became the only members of the Nazi inner circle to die alongside Hitler in the literal as well as the symbolic sense. The contrast with the other major wives of the Nazi leadership could not be more complete. Consider what happened to the women who chose differently. Ilse Hess, whose husband had flown to Scotland on his mad peace mission in 1941 and had spent the rest of the war in British captivity before Nuremberg, moved to a village in Bavaria and lived quietly until 1995. She never renounced her beliefs. She supported organizations that aided former SS members. She defended Rudolf Hess to the end, but she lived. She aged. She outlived virtually everyone who had been part of the same world. Lina Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, survived the war, escaped serious legal consequences, lived for a time in Czechoslovakia, returned to Germany, wrote a memoir that was widely criticized for its lack of remorse, and died in 1985 at the age of 77. Margarete Himmler, wife of the man who had built the concentration camp system, survived the war, was interned briefly, and eventually settled into a quiet life in West Germany, dying in 1967. Emmy Göring fought denazification proceedings, lost some of her assets, wrote an autobiography, and died peacefully in Munich in 1973. These women had all been present at the creation of the regime and had benefited from its power in the most direct and tangible ways. None of them faced serious criminal punishment. None of them paid a price commensurate with the crimes of the system they had adorned and served. They survived, adapted, and found ways to continue. Magda Goebbels did not survive, did not adapt, did not look for a way to continue. This makes her unique among Nazi wives in a way that is simultaneously more extreme and, in a horrible sense, more honest than the fates of the women who outlived their beliefs into a changed world. But honesty in service of a monstrous conviction is not a virtue. And that is the essential complexity at the heart of Magda Goebbels. She was, in certain ways, less of a hypocrite than the Nazi wives who survived. She believed what she claimed to believe, and she acted on it to the ultimate degree. But what she believed was that a world ordered around racial hierarchy and totalitarian violence was the only world worth inhabiting, and that her children should die rather than live in any other kind of world. The coherence between her beliefs and her actions is not redemptive. It is simply the most complete possible expression of how thoroughly a human being can be captured by a totalitarian ideology. To understand Magda Goebbels fully, then, you cannot simply stop at the bunker. You have to understand the life that led there, the choices she made, the alternative paths she declined to take, and the ways in which the regime itself shaped and exploited her capacities, because Magda was not simply a passive instrument. She had agency. She made choices. And the most important of those choices, made not at the very end but throughout the 12 years of the Nazi regime, was the choice to remain committed, to identify herself completely with the project, to place ideological conviction above every other consideration, including, finally, maternal love. That said, it would be a mistake to approach Magda Goebbels as a figure who can be simply condemned and set aside. The historical record, read carefully, reveals someone whose life contains genuine tragedy alongside genuine evil, and whose story illuminates something important about how ordinary human qualities, intelligence, love, loyalty, the desire for meaning can be turned to catastrophic ends when they are channeled through the machinery of an ideology that has abandoned every moral constraint. What did the people who knew her say about her? The testimony of those who were present during the Third Reich is necessarily complicated by the need to manage retrospective guilt and by the distortions of time and fear, but certain impressions recur consistently. Albert Speer, who knew Magda well through his position as Hitler's architect and later armaments minister, wrote about her with a kind of sorrowful admiration, noting her intelligence, her poise, and what he perceived as her increasing desperation in the final years of the war. He believed she had understood, earlier than most, that the war was lost, and that her response to this knowledge had been a kind of progressive withdrawal from any hope of a future. Speer, for all his own moral failings, was a shrewd observer of the people around him, and his portrait of Magda in the final period has a ring of psychological truth to it. Others who encountered her during the Third Reich noted the gap between her public and private presentations. Publicly, she was the serene embodiment of Nazi domesticity. Privately, she was someone who smoked heavily, who drank occasionally, who was subject to periods of dark mood, who read widely, who engaged in debates about ideas with real energy and commitment. She was not shallow. She was not simply performing a role without understanding it. She understood it completely, and she chose it with full awareness of the alternative choices available to her. Let us now examine in more detail the specific ways in which Magda Goebbels differed from the other Nazi wives, because that contrast is essential to understanding why her story has a different moral and historical weight. The other wives of the Nazi leadership were, in varying degrees, complicit in the regime. But their complicity generally took the form of willful blindness, of looking away, of enjoying the privileges that came with proximity to power without interrogating too carefully what the source of those privileges was. Magda was not like that. She did not look away. She looked directly at the regime and found it beautiful. Consider the question of political belief. Emmy Göring, wife of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, was an actress who had found herself swept into the upper reaches of the Nazi state by virtue of marrying one of its most prominent figures. Her political beliefs, to the extent she had articulated ones, were fairly shallow. She liked the social prominence, the estates, the pearls. She was personally charming and not unintelligent, but the ideology of National Socialism was not something she had engaged with seriously or independently. She was a Nazi wife, not a true believer. Lina Heydrich was a more complex case. She had been a committed National Socialist before her marriage to Reinhard Heydrich and had in fact played a significant role in drawing him deeper into the movement. But Lina's Nazism, fierce as it was primarily about ethnic nationalism, about the vision of a racially pure Germany rather than about any deeper ideological structure. When the Reich collapsed, she retained her beliefs but adapted her life around their absence from public power. She wrote her memoir. She complained about Czech confiscation of her Bohemian estate. She minimized her husband's role in the Holocaust. She was a bitter and unreconstructed former Nazi, but she was a functioning former Nazi. She found a way to go on being herself in a world that had rejected the framework that had given her life its shape. Magda could not do this, and the reason she could not do it, the reason she would not do it, takes us back to the nature of her specific attachment to National Socialism. For most of the women around the Nazi leadership, the ideology was in some sense instrumental. It was the vehicle through which their husbands had achieved power and through which they had achieved status. For Magda, the relationship was reversed. The ideology was primary. The personal relationships, including her marriage to Goebbels, were secondary. This is why the relationship with Hitler was so central to her psychological makeup. Hitler, in her experience, was not simply her husband's boss. He was the embodiment of the idea itself. Her devotion to him was a devotion to National Socialism in its most concentrated form. She had made this explicit in conversations recorded by those around her. She spoke of Hitler not merely as a great man or a great leader, but as a world historical figure of a magnitude that came along perhaps once in 1,000 years. She spoke of his mission in terms that would not be out of place in a religious text. This was not mere flattery or social positioning. She meant it. And this absolute conviction, this certainty that she was living through an epoch that dwarfed all others, that she was standing next to the man who would transform the world, gave her life a meaning so intense that its loss was literally unimaginable to her. The psychological profile that emerges from a careful reading of the historical record is of someone who had, in early adulthood, experienced the kind of drifting uncertainty that comes from an unstable childhood and an unsatisfying first marriage, and who had found in National Socialism a total solution to that uncertainty. The movement provided purpose, identity, community, hierarchy, and an all-encompassing explanatory framework for everything wrong with the world and everything that could be made right. These are precisely the things that make totalitarian ideologies so potent and so dangerous. They answer the fundamental human needs for meaning and belonging, and they do so with a completeness that makes any partial answer feel inadequate by comparison. Magda was not unintelligent enough to be taken in by ideology she hadn't thought about. She had thought about it. She found it convincing. And once she found it convincing, her considerable intelligence became an instrument in its service, rather than a check upon it. This is one of the things that makes her story genuinely disturbing, rather than simply horrifying. Horror can be experienced from a safe distance. Genuine disturbance requires a closer engagement with the familiar and recognizable elements of a catastrophic story. And in Magda's story, the recognizable elements are everywhere. The desire for meaning, the love for children, the loyalty to friends, the grief at a failing marriage. These are human things. The direction they took was inhuman. The daily life of the Goebbels household during the Nazi period provides another lens through which to understand Magda's character and her relationship to the regime. The family moved between several residences, their Grand Berlin mansion, the Bogensee Lake estate, and various other properties that came to them through the privileges of ministerial office. In Berlin, the household was managed with considerable efficiency and style. Magda oversaw a large staff. She supervised the children's education with genuine care. She was attentive to what they ate, to how they presented themselves, to the values they were being instilled with. The values, of course, included the racial ideology of the Nazi state, which was not incidental to the upbringing, but central to it. The children were named as they were named precisely to align them with the ideological project. They were raised as symbols as well as children. The relationship between Magda and her children was, by all accounts, one of genuine warmth and love within the framework of this ideological formation. She was not a cold mother. She was not indifferent to them. The photographs of her with her children, of which there are many, given the propaganda value attached to the family, show a woman who appears genuinely present and engaged with them. Contemporary accounts from domestic staff and from family friends corroborate the impression of a mother who was attentive and loving. This is part of what makes the final act so incomprehensible at first encounter, and so comprehensible upon reflection. The love was real. The ideology was also real. When the ideology required the destruction of the love, Magda chose the ideology. There is a remarkable document from the period immediately before the end. In the spring of 1944, as the war was clearly turning decisively against Germany, Magda underwent a period of serious health difficulties. She had been suffering from a painful facial condition that required medical treatment, and she was hospitalized for some weeks. During this period, she wrote letters to various people, and her correspondence from this time reveals someone who was processing the possibility of the regime's defeat in a very particular way. She was not making practical plans. She was not arranging escape routes or trying to protect her assets. She was instead writing in terms that suggest she was already beginning to reconcile herself to an ending that would be absolute. One letter in particular, written to a close female friend, speaks of her certainty that she would not outlive the regime. The language is calm, even philosophical. She writes about the meaning of the life they have all been living, about the historical significance of the project they have all been part of, about her conviction that even if the immediate military struggle is lost, the ideas themselves are not diminished. There is something almost serene about the tone, which is in itself a form of alarm. This was not a woman in the grip of acute despair. This was a woman who had arrived at a very settled and very extreme conclusion. The relationship between Magda and her husband in these final years was outwardly stable, but privately distant. Goebbels was consumed by the demands of running the propaganda apparatus of a regime at war, by his own sustained infidelities, and by the increasingly frantic task of managing the public mood of a country being bombed into rubble. He and Magda shared a household and shared a commitment to the regime, but they did not share an emotional life in any meaningful sense. Those who observed them together in this period describe a couple who were polite to each other, who maintained the social forms of marriage, but who had essentially arrived at a kind of parallel existence. They had the children in common. They had the regime in common. That was, in the end, what held the marriage together. Goebbels, for his part, continued his infidelities almost until the end. He had affairs with various women associated with the film industry, a world that fell under his ministry's control and in which he therefore exercised a kind of sexual power that complemented his political power. This was an open secret among the Nazi elite. Hitler himself was occasionally irritated by it, not out of any moral disapproval, but because the spectacle of the Reich Minister of Propaganda pursuing actresses was not entirely consistent with the regime's domestic imagery. But Goebbels continued regardless. How did Magda process these infidelities in the final years? The testimony of people close to her suggests that she had largely ceased to feel them as acute personal wounds. She had, in a sense, disengaged from the marriage as an emotional reality while remaining within it as a social and ideological structure. What she retained was the role, the position, the function that the marriage gave her. And she retained, with undiminished intensity, her attachment to Hitler personally and to the regime he embodied. The relationship with Hitler in the final years is worth examining in some detail, because it complicates any simple reading of Magda as either victim or perpetrator. Hitler's attention to the Goebbels family and to Magda specifically was genuine rather than merely tactical. He was, by the accounts of many observers, at his most relaxed and apparently human in the company of the Goebbels children. He played with them. He was genuinely fond of them. And in Magda he found something he valued, a woman of intelligence and conviction, who understood the full scope of what he was trying to do and supported it unconditionally. He once described her as the only woman in Germany who truly understood him. This may or may not be literally true, but it reflects the quality of the engagement she offered him. For Magda, these interactions with Hitler were sustaining in a way that her marriage simply was not. They gave her what she needed, which was the sense of being truly seen and appreciated by the person she considered the most important individual alive. The psychological intimacy of the relationship, which was not sexual, as far as historians have been able to determine, was nonetheless real and deep. She was, in the full social and ideological sense, a woman of the court, and Hitler was her sovereign. The feudal analogy is not entirely fanciful. The devotion was of that order. As Germany's military situation deteriorated through 1943, 1944 and into 1945, the psychological pressure on everyone near the centre of the regime became extreme. Allied bombing had turned German cities into killing grounds. The Eastern Front had been a catastrophe since Stalingrad. The Western Allies had landed in France and were pushing toward the Rhine. The propaganda ministry, under Goebbels, was engaged in an increasingly desperate project of maintaining German morale in the face of obvious and overwhelming evidence of impending defeat. Goebbels was, in a perverse way, energized by this challenge. He continued to write and deliver speeches of considerable rhetorical power. He continued to believe, or to act, as though he believed, in eventual German victory, even when rational assessment of the situation made victory impossible. Magda did not share this particular delusion. She had concluded, earlier and more clearly than her husband, that the war was lost, and her response to this conclusion was not to seek a path through the defeat, but to prepare for an ending. She was, in a profound sense, more honest about the situation than Goebbels was, even as her response to it was more extreme. She didn't engage in the fantasy of miraculous reversal. She accepted the defeat and incorporated it into her already settled decision to die with the regime. The Goebbels children throughout this period were being raised in increasing proximity to catastrophe. The Berlin mansion had been damaged in bombing raids. The family had spent time at the Bogensee estate, partly for safety. The children were aware, at some level, that something was very wrong, though the full extent of the war's progress was kept from them as much as possible. Helga, the eldest, was 13 by the time of the bunker, old enough to have formed some understanding of the situation. The younger ones were 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. They were, by every account, lively, normal children who played and squabbled and asked questions and got into mischief in the ordinary way of children everywhere. The photographs of them in the final period showed cheerful faces in grim surroundings, children insulated from reality by their mother's controlled management of their world. What were Magda's stated reasons for including the children in her death? The letter to Harold is the clearest statement of her own explanation. She wrote that she did not want them to grow up in a world without National Socialism, a world in which Germany had been defeated and in which the values she had tried to instill in them would be mocked and rejected. She wrote that she could not bear the thought of them living as the children of war criminals, in poverty and disgrace, subject to the revenge of their enemies. She described the decision as an act of love, the most difficult thing a mother could do, done out of the deepest maternal conviction that this was better for them than survival. Historians and psychologists have debated this explanation at length. Some have accepted it largely at face value. Magda genuinely believed that a world without the Nazi order was not one in which she wanted her children to live, and she acted on that belief. Others have argued that the decision reveals a deeper pathology, a narcissism that ultimately could not separate the children's existence from her own, so that the thought of them continuing to exist in a world from which she was absent, a world that had repudiated everything she stood for, was intolerable to her. On this reading, the murder of the children was less about their well-being and more about her own inability to imagine their lives as genuinely separate from hers. Both of these interpretations contain something true. Magda did believe what she said she believed. And Magda was also, in the way of intensely narcissistic personalities, unable to fully differentiate between her own existence and those of the people most closely connected to her. The ideology, the marriage, the children, the relationship with Hitler, all of these were, for her, part of a single integrated whole. When that whole was destroyed, nothing remained that was separate enough from it to be preserved. The question of what Harold Quandt thought of his mother's letter and the act it described is one that admits of no easy answer. Harold survived the war as a prisoner of the British. He learned of his siblings' deaths and his mother's death after his release. He eventually returned to Germany and resumed his life as part of the Quandt business empire, one of the largest industrial conglomerates in West Germany. He married. He had children. He lived until 1967 when he died in a plane crash in Italy. His public statements about his mother and about the deaths of his half-siblings were minimal. The subject was apparently too painful and too complex for public discussion. That he mourned them seems certain. What he thought about the choices his mother made is something he took with him. One element of Magda's biography that deserves particular attention because it distinguishes her sharply from most of the other Nazi wives is the international dimension of her character and upbringing. She had been educated partly in Belgium, she spoke French, she had had relationships, including the serious one with Viktor Allosaroff, that crossed the ethnic and national lines that National Socialism was dedicated to making absolute. She knew from personal experience that the world was more complicated and more interconnected than the Nazi ideology's cartoon version of it. This knowledge did not moderate her commitment to the ideology. If anything, the fact that she came to the ideology from this more cosmopolitan background made her commitment to it more fully chosen and therefore, in some sense, more complete. She was not simply doing what people in her world did. She had seen other ways of living and rejected them. The Allosaroff connection is particularly haunting in this context. Viktor Allosaroff was assassinated in Tel Aviv in June 1933, just months after the Nazi seizure of power. His murder has never been definitively attributed, though various theories have been advanced over the decades. Magda, by that point, was the wife of the Reich Minister of Propaganda in a government that was enthusiastically persecuting the Jewish community to which Allosaroff had belonged. Whether she knew of his death, what she thought if she did, whether any trace of her earlier feeling for him survived into her life as a committed Nazi wife. None of this is knowable from the historical record, but the juxtaposition is stark. The man she once loved, a Jewish Zionist dedicated to the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, was being murdered in the same historical moment that she was celebrating the triumph of a regime dedicated to the destruction of Jewish life in Europe. The cultural life of the Nazi period, which Magda inhabited at the highest level, was another arena in which her distinctive character expressed itself. The Third Reich had a complicated and ultimately destructive relationship with culture, driven by ideological imperatives that were at war with artistic freedom. The propaganda ministry under Goebbels controlled German film, theatre, music and visual arts, imposing both positive requirements, the production of work that served Nazi ideological goals, and negative prohibitions, the suppression and exile of art and artists deemed racially or politically unacceptable. Magda, with her genuine interest in the arts and her access to the highest levels of cultural production in Nazi Germany, was both a consumer and in some sense a commissioner of this managed culture. She had opinions about German cinema that were genuinely informed and occasionally at odds with her husband's more purely instrumental approach to the medium. She valued aesthetic quality, not merely political utility. She was a patron of sorts to figures in the cultural world who interested her, and she could deploy her social position to provide access and opportunity to those she favoured. This was not simply the cultural consumption of a minister's wife. It reflected genuine aesthetic engagement, but everything in the cultural sphere of the Nazi regime was ultimately in service of the political project, and Magda's aesthetic preferences were not separable from her ideological commitments. She wanted German culture to be great because a great Germany was what the regime was supposed to be building. The beauty of the art was evidence of the correctness of the ideology. This circular logic, in which everything good confirmed the regime and everything bad could be attributed to its enemies, was characteristic of totalitarian thinking generally, but Magda embodied it with particular completeness. There is an interesting historical question about whether Magda ever experienced significant moments of doubt about the regime and its direction. The honest answer is that the historical record provides very little evidence of any such doubt. There are no documents, no letters, no recorded conversations that suggest a woman who was privately questioning the foundations of her commitment. What the record does show is a woman who occasionally expressed discomfort with specific individuals or specific decisions within the regime, who had complicated personal feelings about her husband and about various people around the Nazi leadership, but who never apparently questioned the core project itself. This is itself historically significant. Many of the people around the Nazi leadership during the war years experienced at least private moments of doubt as the scale of the regime's crimes and the certainty of its defeat became undeniable. Albert Speer, who later made a career of his claimed belated awakening, is the most famous example, though historians disagree about how genuine his doubts were. Others, from military figures to bureaucratic functionaries, record moments of discomfort, hesitation, or private rejection of specific aspects of what they were part of. Magda shows none of this. Her commitment remained total. What does this tell us? It tells us something important about the specific kind of personality that was most fully captured by National Socialism. Magda was not a person who had stumbled into the regime through circumstance or social pressure and found herself unable to escape. She was a person who had chosen the regime because it answered something deep in her psychological makeup, something she had been missing before and could not afford to lose once she had found it. The regime was not her social context, it was herself. Among the women of the Nazi elite, there were those who had come to the movement primarily through their husbands and those who had come to it independently. Magda was, in a sense, neither exactly. She had encountered the movement when she was already an independent adult woman after the end of her first marriage, during a period of genuine personal searching. She had adopted it freely, and then she had found her husband within it rather than coming to it through him. Her commitment predated and was in important ways independent of Goebbels himself. This is part of why, despite the miseries of the marriage, she never seriously considered leaving in a way that would also have meant leaving the movement. Leaving Goebbels without leaving the regime was not really a coherent option for her, because she had not come to the regime through Goebbels and could not imagine life outside it, regardless of her personal circumstances. The propaganda functions that Magda performed during the Nazi period went beyond simply presenting an attractive public image of the regime's domestic ideal. She was sometimes called upon to provide a personal and emotional dimension to Nazi public life that the male leadership found difficult to supply. She spoke at party functions about motherhood and sacrifice and the German family in ways that carried genuine conviction, because they reflected genuine belief. She was not reciting lines. She was testifying to what she actually felt. This gave her public appearances a quality that distinguished them from the routine propaganda output of the regime. People listening to her did not feel, as they sometimes felt with Goebbels himself, that they were being managed. They felt they were hearing something authentic. The irony that this authentic voice was in service of a thoroughly inauthentic project, a vision of German domestic life that masked violence and exploitation and murder, is one of the characteristic ironies of the Nazi period. The regime specialized in the deployment of authentic emotion in service of monstrous ends. Magda was one of its most effective instruments for this precisely because her commitment was genuine. Her physical health during the final years of the war was deteriorating. She suffered from a painful trigeminal neuralgia, a condition affecting the facial nerve that caused intense, recurring pain. She had been treated at a clinic and had undergone various procedures to manage the condition. The pain was ongoing and was apparently significant enough to affect her daily functioning at various points. Whether the chronic pain had any effect on her psychological state and on the decisions she made in the final period is impossible to determine, but some historians have noted it as part of the picture of a woman under multiple forms of extreme pressure in those last years. The social world of the Nazi elite that Magda moved through was itself a strange and claustrophobic environment that shaped the people within it in ways that are easy to underestimate from the outside. The Nazi inner circle was not a normal political class. It was a group of people who were simultaneously exercising total power over a nation of 70 million people and living under the absolute authority of one man whose psychological state was deteriorating and whose decision-making had become increasingly detached from military and political reality by the war's middle years. The combination of omnipotence in relation to everyone outside the circle and absolute subordination in relation to Hitler created a particular kind of psychological pressure that expressed itself differently in different personalities. Goebbels thrived on it. He was someone whose psychological needs were served by proximity to absolute power, who derived energy and vitality from the drama and the extremity of the situation. Magda was different. The evidence suggests that she found the situation as it became more extreme, not energizing, but clarifying. The collapse of the regime stripped away everything contingent and left only the essential. And what she found essential was the commitment that had defined her adult life. In this sense, the final act, terrible as it was, had a kind of horrible integrity. It was the logical conclusion of premises she had held for 15 years, not a sudden departure from her character, but the fullest expression of it. A woman who had staked everything on the regime had, when the regime fell, nothing left to stake. And so she paid everything. How does this compare to the other Nazi wives? None of them experienced this kind of absolute identification between themselves and the regime. Emmy Göring, interned briefly after the war, was focused on practical matters, on recovering her possessions, on protecting her daughter Edda, on managing the legal proceedings against her. Lina Heydrich was focused on her property claims, her reputation, her version of history. Margarete Himmler was focused on survival, on her son Gebhard, on the dismal practical business of rebuilding a life in a country where her name was a source of shame. All of these were human responses to a catastrophic situation. They were trying to survive, which is what human beings normally do. Magda was not trying to survive. She had decided not to. And the question of whether this makes her, in some paradoxical sense, a more complete Nazi than the women who adapted and survived is one that resists easy resolution. There is something almost admirable in a purely formal sense about a commitment so complete that it survives even the instinct for self-preservation. And then there is the small matter of the 6 children in the bunker: Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, Heide. Their names had meaning to her. They were not abstractions. They were her children whom she loved, and she killed them anyway. That is the bottommost truth of Magda Goebbels, and the reason her story carries a weight that the stories of the surviving Nazi wives do not. They were complicit in a system that murdered millions. She murdered her children. The scale is not comparable. But the intimacy of her crime, the fact that the victims were her own flesh and blood, that she knew each face and each name, that she had been present for each birth and each childhood moment, this gives her act a quality of horror that operates differently from the vast statistical horror of the Holocaust. It is personal, specific, and it happened in a room. The bunker itself, in the final days of April 1945, was a world in miniature. Hitler was still technically in command of a Germany that had essentially ceased to exist in any functional sense. The Red Army was fighting in the streets of Berlin. The Reich Chancellery above was being shelled. Underground, in the concrete warrens that had been extended and elaborated over the course of the war, a small group of people was living out the last days of a 12-year nightmare. Some of them were there because they had no choice. Others were there because they had chosen to be. Magda was among the latter. She had been given multiple opportunities to leave. Albert Speer himself, in one of his final visits to the bunker, urged her to take the children and go. She refused. Various others made similar suggestions, similar offers of help. She declined them all. She was, by this point, fully committed to the ending she had decided upon. The children, brought into the bunker with her, played in the corridors, ate their meals, asked questions about the noise of the fighting above. They did not know what was coming. The historical record of what happened in the Führerbunker in those final days is drawn from a number of sources, each with its own limitations and distortions. The testimony of people who were there and survived, including Hitler's personal secretary Traudl Junge, various military and SS officers, and domestic staff, provides the most direct accounts. Junge, whose memoir and subsequent interviews provided some of the most valuable material for understanding the atmosphere of the bunker in its final days, wrote about Magda with a mixture of sympathy and horror that captures the essential ambivalence she inspires. Junge described Magda as maintaining a kind of surface composure that made her own awareness of what she intended even more unsettling. She was not hysterical. She was not visibly distraught. She was quiet, attentive to the children, almost unnaturally calm. Junge also recalled a conversation in which Magda explained her reasoning directly. She spoke of the new world that would come after Germany's defeat, a world she described as one in which her children could not be who they were, could not hold the values they had been taught, could not live with dignity. She spoke of it as though she were making a practical calculation rather than an ideological statement, though the two were inseparable in her mind. The children would be better off, she believed, not surviving into a world that would reject and punish everything they had been raised to believe and be. Junge herself found this incomprehensible. Junge was a young woman who had not had children and who was trying to survive the war, and to her the idea that survival was not worth having was simply alien. This is part of what the contrast between Magda and the surviving Nazi wives reveals. The difference between those who were committed enough to the ideology to die for it and those for whom the ideology was, when it came down to it, less important than the basic human drive to continue living. Adolf Hitler had taken his own life on April 30th, 1945, in the bunker. Eva Braun, whom Hitler had finally married in a brief ceremony in the early hours of April 29th, just hours before their deaths, died alongside him by biting down on a cyanide capsule. Hitler then shot himself. Their bodies were burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden by staff who had been instructed to do so, though the burning was incomplete and the Soviet forces who arrived found the remains. The death of Hitler shattered what remained of the bunker community. For those who had organised their entire existence around proximity to him, his absence was a kind of final void. For Magda, Hitler's death the day before her own appears to have confirmed rather than disrupted her decision. He had gone ahead of her, and she would follow. The regime, its most essential embodiment gone, could no longer exist in any meaningful sense. What remained for her after that was simply the practical execution of what had already been decided. Joseph Goebbels, in the hours after. Hitler's death dictated what he described as an addendum to Hitler's political testament. In this document he wrote that he and his wife had made the decision to remain in Berlin and to die there, and that they had decided the same for their children, describing this decision as freely made and as an expression of their loyalty to the Führer and to the cause. The document is a piece of propaganda even in its final form, the propagandist unable to resist shaping his own death into a usable narrative. But it also reflects a genuine agreement between husband and wife, one of the few things they had agreed upon with complete mutual understanding in years. The question of Goebbels' specific role in the children's deaths has been examined carefully by historians. The most credible reconstruction suggests that while Goebbels knew what Magda intended and did not attempt to prevent it, the actual administration of the poison to the children was Magda's act and Magda's alone. Whether this represents a division of moral responsibility or simply a division of labour in a jointly decided act is something that individual historians have assessed differently. What seems clear is that both parents had arrived at the same conclusion, that the children should not survive, and that both bore responsibility for it. The dentist Helmut Kuntz, who later gave testimony about his role, claimed that he had been asked by Magda to administer the cyanide to the children and that he had refused to do so, providing only the sedative injection that put them to sleep. He claimed that Magda then administered the poison herself, assisted or accompanied by Ludwig Stumpfegger, another doctor present in the bunker. The exact sequence has been disputed, and Kunz's testimony was given by a man with obvious reasons to minimize his own involvement, but the broad outline that Magda was present and active in the final act is not contested. After the children's deaths, Magda and Joseph Goebbels made their way to the Chancellery Garden. They had both written their final communications, had settled what practical matters remained to be settled, had said whatever they intended to say to the small number of people still present. Their deaths, on the evening of May 1st, 1945, were witnessed by several bunker personnel. The bodies were doused with petrol and set alight, as Hitler and Braun's had been. But the burning was again incomplete, and Soviet forces found the remains, which were identified through various means, including dental records. The aftermath of Magda Goebbels' death unfolded in the strange, chaotic world of post-war Germany. Her son Harold, informed as a prisoner of war, eventually returned to Germany and took his place in the Quandt industrial enterprise. He was, by most accounts, a man who carried his history with enormous difficulty, who found the subject of his mother and his half-siblings almost impossible to speak about publicly, and who devoted his energies to the practical world of business rather than to any public engagement with the legacy of the regime. He died in 1967 at the age of 45 in a plane crash near Caserta, Italy. He never wrote publicly about what his mother had done. The Quandt family itself became the subject of considerable controversy in subsequent decades, when the extent of their use of forced labour during the Nazi period became public. Günther Quandt, Magda's first husband and Harold's father, had built significant parts of his industrial empire using forced labourers, including concentration camp prisoners during the war years. This history was examined in a documentary broadcast in Germany in 2007 that generated enormous public discussion about the family's responsibility for its wartime past. The Quandts ultimately acknowledged this history and established a foundation to compensate survivors. Magda, who had spent time in this family before moving on to Goebbels, had left before the worst of these labour practices, but the history connects the two halves of her life in uncomfortable ways. The legacy of Magda Goebbels in German cultural memory has been complex and evolving. In the immediate post-war years, the dominant response to her story was horror pure and simple, the horror of a mother who had killed her children. As the decades passed and historical understanding of the Nazi period deepened, the response became more analytical, more engaged with questions of psychology, ideology, and the nature of extreme commitment. Biographies appeared at intervals, each attempting to make sense of a life that resists easy categorization. Films have been made about the bunker period, and Magda is a recurring and inevitably central figure in these dramatizations, always posing the same challenge to the actors and directors who attempt to portray her. How do you play someone who is both a loving mother and a child murderer? Someone who is both genuinely intelligent and utterly captured by an ideology built on hatred. The most thoughtful treatments have concluded that these are not contradictions to be resolved, but tensions to be maintained. Magda Goebbels was all of these things simultaneously. Her intelligence did not moderate her ideology. Her love for her children did not prevent their murder. Her genuine warmth toward individuals did not produce any compassion for the anonymous millions the regime was destroying. These apparent contradictions are actually the point. They tell us something important about the capacity of human beings to compartmentalize, to maintain bright interior moral categories while participating in exterior moral catastrophe. The particular question of what distinguishes Magda from the other Nazi wives is worth returning to now that we have examined her life in some depth. The most fundamental distinction is not the manner of her death, dramatic as that is. The most fundamental distinction is the depth of her ideological commitment, which was of a different order from the commitments of the women who surrounded her. Consider Gerda Bormann, wife of Martin Bormann, who was herself a committed National Socialist and who wrote letters to her husband that expressed bloodthirsty anti-Semitism in the most direct and unguarded terms. Gerda Bormann was no mere fellow traveller. She was a genuine Nazi by conviction. But she was also someone who, when the war was clearly lost, focused her energies on protecting her children and finding a way through the collapse. She moved to Bolzano in Italy, where she died of cancer in 1946. Her end was not chosen in the ideological sense that Magda's was. She was overtaken by events and by illness. Consider also Henriette von Schirach, wife of the Hitler youth leader Baldur von Schirach. She was someone who, unusually among the Nazi inner circle's women, had actually attempted to intervene on behalf of Jewish people she knew personally, bringing their situation to Hitler's attention at a dinner in a way that infuriated him and led to her effective exclusion from his circle. This did not make her a resistance figure or a moral hero, and the limitations of her intervention tell their own story about the nature of Nazi morality, which could accommodate personal compassion toward known individuals while supporting systematic murder of anonymous populations. But it does demonstrate that even among people very close to the centre of the regime, there were moments of individual moral reflex. Magda showed no such moments in the historical record. The comparison with Emmy Göring is in some ways the most instructive, because Emmy was in many respects Magda's social counterpart, the wife of the regime's second most prominent figure, a woman of elegance and social presence who presided over one of the grandest households in Nazi Germany. Emmy was also, unlike Magda, genuinely interested in protecting her own life and her daughter's life when the end came. She arranged for valuables to be hidden. She focused her energies on survival. She was interned briefly, lost assets, fought the denazification proceedings, and then rebuilt her life with the same practical energy she had always brought to managing the Göring household. She was not indifferent to the regime's ideology, but her primary attachment was to the material and social world it had provided, rather than to the ideology itself. When that world ended, she redirected her energy toward a new version of it. The contrast with Magda could not be sharper. For Emmy Göring, the regime was the context of her life. For Magda Goebbels, the regime was her life. That is the essential difference, and it explains everything that followed from it. There is one more dimension of Magda's story that deserves attention before we consider her legacy in full. This is the question of her relationship to the Holocaust itself, which was not peripheral to her world, but was being conducted, in large part, through the machinery her husband controlled, and in the context of the broader Nazi project she had identified herself with completely. The propaganda ministry's role in the Holocaust was not primarily operational, that belonged to Himmler and the SS apparatus, but it was important in a different sense. Goebbels' ministry provided the ideological preparation, the anti-Semitic saturation of German cultural life that made the genocide possible by making its victims seem less than human in the perception of the German public. Magda was fully aware of this work and supported it. She had grown up with a Jewish stepfather, she had loved a Jewish man, and she spent her adult life in service of a regime whose central project was the destruction of European Jewry. The personal history makes the ideological commitment all the more stark. She was not someone who had grown up in an environment where Jewish people were distant abstractions. She had known them as specific, particular human beings, and she had concluded that this made no difference. The ideology superseded the personal experience. The category superseded the individual. Richard Friedlander, her stepfather, died in Buchenwald in 1939. He had been arrested by the regime her husband served and had died in one of the camps that regime had built. She did not, as far as the historical record shows, make any serious effort to intervene on his behalf. She continued in her role as the wife of the Reich Minister of Propaganda, the First Lady of the Third Reich in everything but formal title, and she continued to speak publicly about the values of the German family and the German mother. The gap between that public role and the private reality of her stepfather dying in a camp is one of the most devastating indictments of a life already full of them. What would Magda Goebbels' life have looked like had the Nazis never come to power? It is a counterfactual that illuminates something real about her. She was, in many respects, a woman well suited to prominence in any political or cultural world. Her intelligence, her social gifts, her genuine interest in ideas, her personal magnetism, these are not qualities specific to National Socialism. They are simply human qualities. In a different Germany, a more stable Weimar Republic perhaps, or a Germany that had found its way through the economic catastrophe of the late 1920s without turning to fascism, Magda Berend might have found a different vehicle for her ambitions and her need for meaning. She might have been a politician herself in a republic that was developing women's political participation. She might have been a cultural figure, a patroness, a writer. She had the gifts for several things, that she turned them all toward National Socialism, and that the result was the bunker and the 6 children is a tragedy of the most complete kind. The waste not only of life but of capacity, of potential, of qualities that in a different world might have served rather than destroyed. The biographies of Magda Goebbels that have been produced over the decades vary considerably in their approach and their conclusions. The earliest ones, written in the immediate post-war period, tended to focus almost exclusively on the horror of her final act, treating her as a monster without extensive psychological or historical context. Later biographies, beginning to emerge in the 1970s and proliferating through subsequent decades, attempted more nuanced assessments. They drew on the growing body of documentation from the period, on the memoirs of survivors, on German and Soviet archives as they became more accessible, and on the developing academic understanding of National Socialism and its psychology. The most comprehensive biography in English, Anja Klabunder's work published in German in 1999 and subsequently translated, examined Magda's life from its earliest beginnings and attempted to trace the specific psychological and biographical threads that led to the bunker. Klabunder's portrait is sympathetic in the sense of seeking understanding without offering absolution, which is the appropriate approach to a subject of this kind. She presented Magda as someone whose childhood instabilities had created a profound hunger for certainty and belonging, a hunger that National Socialism satisfied with catastrophic completeness. A subsequent major biography by Hans Otto Meissner took a somewhat different approach, focusing more on the political and social world of the Nazi inner circle and on the specifics. Dynamics of the Goebbels marriage. Meissner had access to sources and recollections that earlier writers did not, and his portrait of the marriage, with its sustained mutual unhappiness and its external compulsion by Hitler's preference for the family's continuation, added important dimensions to the picture. The most recent scholarship has tended to focus on specific aspects of Magda's story that earlier biographers had examined less fully, including the question of her ideological development before her marriage to Goebbels, the nature of her relationship with Hitler, and the ways in which her personal history, including the Alloserov connection and the Friedländer stepfather, complicates any simple reading of her as merely a committed anti-Semite following her husband. The picture that emerges from this scholarship is of someone whose biography is genuinely complex, not in the sense that it exculpates her, but in the sense that it makes visible the full range of choices she made and the full extent of her agency at each stage. Agency is the key concept here. Magda was not a passive victim of circumstance. She was not simply following her husband or following orders. She was an adult woman of considerable intelligence who, at each major juncture of her life, made deliberate choices. She chose National Socialism before she married Goebbels. She chose to remain in the marriage despite sustained opportunities and incentives to leave. She chose to identify herself completely with the regime's ideology rather than maintaining any private reservation. She chose to remain in Berlin in the final days rather than accepting help to escape. And she chose to kill her children rather than give them the chance to make their own choices about how to live in a world without the regime she had served. The irony of that last choice, from the perspective of what we know about the lives of children of Nazi leaders, is worth dwelling on briefly. The children of Nazi leaders who did survive, including the Goebbels children's near contemporaries in age, generally went on to live lives of considerable struggle with their parents' legacies. But they did live. Harold Quant's children survived. The children of various senior Nazis, Albert Speer's son, Baldur von Schirach's children, and others, all had to confront what their parents had done and find ways to live with it. Some of them spent their lives in public repudiation of their parents' ideology. Some of them retreated into silence. Some of them struggled with the weight of the name they carried. But they had lives. They had choices. They had the possibility of becoming something other than what their parents had made them. Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Heide Goebbels had no such possibility because their mother decided for them that they would not. That Magda made this decision from love, that she genuinely believed she was protecting them from suffering, doesn't alter the fact that it was a decision she had no right to make. They were people, not possessions. They were children, not symbols. Their lives were not hers to end, and in ending them she demonstrated with the most terrible clarity the ultimate logic of a totalitarianism that refuses to recognize any individual existence as having value independent of its ideological function. This is the deepest reason why Magda Goebbels stands opposite every other Nazi wife. The others, whatever their crimes of complicity, preserved their children. They tried to protect them. Emmy Göring focused her energies after the war largely on securing a decent life for her daughter Edda. Lina Heydrich raised her children, including the children she had with Heydrich, and attempted, however inadequately, to provide for them in the difficult post-war years. Margarete Himmler protected her son Gebhard, even as her husband's name made his life extraordinarily difficult. Ilse Hess raised her son Wolf alone throughout Rudolf Hess's imprisonment. The other Nazi wives, whatever ideology they carried in their hearts, had the fundamental human instinct to preserve their children's lives intact. Magda did not. Or rather, her instinct to preserve them was overridden by her ideological conviction about the world they would have to inhabit. This is the measure of how completely she had been captured. Not the measure of her evil, which is real, but the measure of the totality of the ideology's hold on her. She could love her children with genuine maternal warmth, and she could still, in the end, kill them for an idea. No one else in the inner circle of the Nazi leadership, male or female, did this. Goebbels did not kill himself for the ideology without also being prepared to kill the children. Hitler himself did not kill children in the bunker. He killed his dog, which caused Traudl-Junge to note in her memoir with considerable bitterness that this disturbed her more than many things she had witnessed, but he did not murder children. It was Magda who did that. The children's remains were identified after the war and have been the subject of forensic and historical investigation at various points. In 2005, during construction work in Berlin, remains that had been discovered in 1972 and subsequently held in Soviet archives were finally identified through DNA testing as those of the Goebbels children. They were eventually reinterred. The German state had for decades struggled with the question of what to do with the remains of people whose deaths were simultaneously a war crime and a tragedy, whose murders were simultaneously evidence of Nazi ideology's ultimate logic and an intimate family catastrophe. The eventual interment, without ceremony and without public announcement, was perhaps the most appropriate response possible. Acknowledgement without celebration, burial without memorial. The Goebbels name has had a complicated afterlife in Germany and beyond. Joseph Goebbels has remained one of the most studied figures of the Nazi period, the subject of extensive scholarship on propaganda, on media manipulation, on the specific techniques by which mass hatred is manufactured and sustained. His diaries, which were preserved in large part and have been published in various editions, remain one of the primary documentary sources for understanding the inner world of the Nazi leadership. They are also, incidentally, one of the primary sources for understanding Magda, whom he observed and recorded with the obsessive attention of a man who was simultaneously fascinated by and estranged from the woman he had married. In Goebbels' diaries, Magda appears as a recurring presence, sometimes admired, sometimes criticised, often described with the detachment of a journalist observing an interesting subject rather than the intimacy of a husband writing about a wife. He noted her intelligence, her social gifts, her occasional stubbornness, her ongoing health difficulties. He noted, in the final period, her absolute calm as events moved toward their end. He did not, in the diary entries that survive, record anything that reads as genuine, intimate knowledge of what she was feeling. The marriage that had been held together by external pressure and shared ideology appears in the diary record as exactly what it was. Two people living in proximity to each other, united by a project rather than by a relationship. For all his rhetorical gifts and all his psychological acuity in observing others, Goebbels does not seem to have truly understood Magda. He understood her as a political and social asset. He respected her mind. He was sometimes genuinely moved by her, but he did not know her in the deepest sense. The person who perhaps understood her most fully and who valued what she was most genuinely was Hitler himself, who recognized in her the kind of absolute commitment that he valued above all other qualities, and that he found, in his experience, to be extremely rare. There is something almost classical in the structure of Magda's life, in the Greek tragic sense. A woman of extraordinary gifts, shaped by an unstable early life into a hunger for certainty, finds in a totalitarian ideology the certainty she craved. She rises to the summit of the world that ideology creates, living for 12 years at the center of power in what is presented as the greatest civilizational project in human history. And then the project falls, and she falls with it in the most complete and irreversible way possible, taking with her the 6 most precious things in her life, because she cannot imagine their lives as being worth having in a world that has rejected the only framework she has ever found meaningful. The question of how to teach the story of Magda Goebbels is one that educators and historians have grappled with seriously. She is too important to omit from any serious account of the Nazi period, but she is also too complex to serve as a simple cautionary tale of the kind that is comfortable to present in educational settings. Her story does not reduce to a warning about the dangers of following a bad leader or of letting social pressures override individual moral judgment. Those lessons are true, but not adequate to what her life actually demonstrates. What her life demonstrates, at its most essential level, is the danger of a particular kind of absolute certainty. The conviction that one possesses a total understanding of history and humanity that overrides any individual consideration, any personal relationship, any competing claim of loyalty or love. This kind of certainty, the certainty that turns people into categories rather than persons, that makes the ideology more real than the children sleeping in the next room, is not a property unique to National Socialism. It has appeared in various forms throughout history, attached to various ideological frameworks. What National Socialism provided was an unusually efficient mechanism for cultivating and sustaining this certainty. An unusually complete apparatus for surrounding individuals with confirming evidence and excluding disconfirming experience, and an unusually concentrated moment of historical crisis in which the full implications of the certainty could be realized without restraint. Magda Goebbels was, in this sense, not simply a Nazi. She was a human being who had been captured by the worst version of a human failing that exists in milder forms in many places. The recognition of this, the recognition that the elements of her story are not entirely alien to ordinary human experience, is not a comfort. It is precisely the opposite. It is a warning of the most fundamental kind. The 6 children whose lives she ended were the most innocent victims of her conviction. But they were not the only ones. The regime she supported, the husband she remained loyal to, the ideology she embodied publicly, all of these were part of a system that murdered 6 million Jews and tens of millions of others. Her complicity in that larger murder was real, even if it was indirect. The children in the bunker were the most visible evidence of what happens when ideology completely overrides humanity, but they were the final manifestation of a process that had been underway for 12 years. In the end, what separates Magda Goebbels from every other Nazi wife is not simply that she died and they survived. It is that she chose death, and not only for herself, but for her children, and she chose it for ideological reasons. The other women, whatever they believed, ultimately valued their own lives and their children's lives more than they valued the ideology. This makes them, in a narrow technical sense, less absolutely committed to the ideology than Magda was. It also makes them, in every human and moral sense, better people than Magda was. The hierarchy of commitment and the hierarchy of decency run in opposite directions here, and the distance between them is measured in 6 children's lives. The story of Magda Goebbels is not a story with a redemptive ending or a reassuring moral. It is a story about what human beings can become when they are given an absolute ideology and a structure of power that insulates them from the normal consequences of their beliefs. It is a story about the specific danger of the kind of intelligent, passionate, committed person who finds in totalitarianism not an imposition, but a fulfillment. And it is a story about 6 children who went to sleep and did not wake up because their mother had decided that the world without the regime she loved was not a world worth giving them. To understand fully why Magda Goebbels stands as the opposite of every other Nazi wife, it helps to consider not only what she did at the end, but what each of the other wives did afterward, because the contrast between their post-war lives and her absence from the post-war world illuminates everything. The post-war lives of the Nazi wives constitute a strange and troubling chapter in the history of accountability and its failure. And against this backdrop, Magda's absolute ending takes on a different kind of significance. Ilse Hess had the longest post-war life of any of the major Nazi wives. Born in 1900, she survived until 1995, living to the age of 95. Her husband, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, had flown to Scotland in 1941 on his bizarre mission to negotiate a private peace with the Duke of Hamilton, had been captured, had been tried at Nuremberg, and had received a life sentence rather than death because of the unusual circumstances of his case. He was imprisoned at Spandau Prison in Berlin, where he remained until his death in 1987 at the age of 93. During the 46 years of his imprisonment, Ilse devoted substantial energy to campaigns for his release. She wrote books, she gave interviews, she maintained correspondence with people sympathetic to her husband's cause. She never renounced National Socialism. She never expressed anything that could be honestly described as remorse for the regime she had been part of. She supported Stille Hilfe, an organization that provided assistance to former SS members facing legal proceedings. She was, in the full sense of the term, an unreconstructed Nazi who survived long enough to reach a Germany in which open Nazism was illegal and socially unacceptable, and who navigated this changed world by maintaining her beliefs privately while presenting them publicly in the softer form of personal loyalty to a husband unjustly imprisoned. She died in her sleep in 1995. She had not spent a single night in prison for her own beliefs and actions. Lina Heydrich outlived her husband by more than 4 decades. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the Wannsee Conference and the Final Solution, had been assassinated in Prague in June 1942, the result of a British organised operation using Czech and Slovak paratroopers. He was the highest-ranking Nazi official to be killed by enemy action during the war. Lina, a committed National Socialist who had in some respects been more ideologically extreme than her husband in their early life together, survived the war in the Bohemian estates where the family had lived, was expelled from Czechoslovakia in 1945 along with the German population, and returned to Germany. She faced legal proceedings that went nowhere significant. She eventually won a court case against the West German government, establishing her right to a widow's pension as the wife of a senior SS officer, a verdict that caused considerable public scandal. She wrote a memoir, published in 1976, in which she portrayed her husband as a complex figure, wrongly vilified by history, and in which she avoided any serious engagement with the crimes of the regime he had served so centrally. She died in 1985. She had never been convicted of anything. Margarete Himmler, wife of the man who had built and commanded the SS, the organization that had administered the Holocaust, also survived the war with minimal legal consequences. Heinrich Himmler, captured by British forces shortly after Germany's surrender, had killed himself with a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth when confronted with the prospect of interrogation and trial. Margarete, who had been separated from her husband for years and who had in any case maintained a degree of personal distance from the most extreme aspects of his work, was interned briefly, released, and eventually settled in a small West German town where she lived quietly until her death in 1967. Her daughter Gudrun, by contrast, became one of the most publicly unrepentant children of the Nazi elite, maintaining in later life an active involvement with the Stille Hilfe organization and never publicly disavowing her father's legacy. Margaret's quiet survival, her disappearance into provincial German life, stands as a near-perfect example of how the wives of the most extreme Nazi criminals were able to exit history almost without consequence. Emmy Göring's post-war life has already been mentioned, but it is worth examining in slightly more detail for what it reveals about the nature of the denazification process and its limitations. Emmy was tried by a German denazification court, found guilty of being a Nazi, and sentenced to a year's imprisonment plus the confiscation of 30% of her assets. She served her sentence and was released. She was prohibited from working as an actress for 5 years. She then moved into a small apartment in Munich, wrote her memoir, received visitors, and gradually faded into the background of post-war German life. The assets that had surrounded her during the Nazi period, the art treasures, the mansions, the jewellery, the furs, much of it acquired through looting and corruption, were largely seized or otherwise disposed of. But she was not left destitute. She had enough. She lived to 1973, dying at 80, having written her version of events, having presented her marriage to Göring and her life in the Third Reich as essentially a private story of love and family rather than a participation in the machinery of mass murder. The contrast with Magda's absence from this post-war world of careful self-presentation and managed memory is stark. Had Magda survived, what would she have done? The question is in some ways unanswerable because the person she was seems so deeply incompatible with the mode of survival the other wives adopted. She was not someone who could have convincingly presented her involvement with the regime as merely personal rather than ideological. She had been too public, too committed, too explicitly identified with the ideology itself. She could not have written Emmy Göring's memoir, presenting herself as fundamentally a wife and mother who had happened to be married to a powerful man. She would have had to either maintain her beliefs openly, which would have been legally and socially impossible, or undergo a conversion of a magnitude that seems, given everything we know about her character, essentially inconceivable. There is also the matter of the children. Had Magda survived and the children had survived with her, she would have faced the question of how to raise them in a post-war Germany that was attempting, however imperfectly, to come to terms with what the Nazi regime had done. The 6 Goebbels children, named for Hitler, raised as the living symbols of the Nazi ideal of German womanhood in its most public form, would have been among the most immediately recognizable Nazi children in Germany. Their lives would have been extraordinarily difficult in ways that none of the other children of the Nazi elite, however burdened by their parents' names, had to face in quite the same way. Whether Magda's stated concern about this, her expressed belief that the children would face an unlivable world, reflected a genuine assessment of the difficulties they would encounter, or whether it was a rationalization of what was primarily an ideological decision, is something the historical record does not definitively answer. But here is what we do know. Every child of the Nazi elite who survived the war went on to have a life. Harold Quandt, who was the son of Magda's first marriage and who therefore carried the most indirect possible connection to the Goebbels name, built a successful business career and lived until 1967. The children of Albert Speer, of Baldur von Schirach, of Karl Dönitz, of other senior Nazis, all of them burdened by their names and their fathers' histories, nonetheless found ways to build lives. Some of them became the most committed public opponents of their parents' legacy. Wolf Hess, Rudolf's son, lived until 2001. Gudrun Himmler, Heinrich's daughter, lived for decades and remained, controversially, attached to her father's memory. Martin Bormann Jr., son of the man who had been Hitler's secretary, became a Catholic priest and devoted his later life to work with survivors of the Holocaust. None of them had the life they would have had in a world where their fathers had not been who they were. But they had lives. The 6 Goebbels children would have had lives too, had they been given them. Whether those lives would have been good ones, whether they would have found ways through the crushing weight of their family history, whether they would have become, like some of their near contemporaries, critics and repudiators of the ideology they had been raised in, is something we cannot know. What we can say is that they would have had the chance to find out. Magda took that chance from them. She took it in the name of love and in the service of ideology, and in doing so she committed the act that defines her in history as the most extreme figure among the Nazi wives. The woman who was not merely willing to die for her beliefs, but willing to kill for them in the most intimate possible way. The scholarly debate about Magda Goebbels continues. Historians have examined her through multiple lenses: psychological, ideological, social, biographical, and each examination adds something to the picture. But certain things are clear and beyond serious dispute. She was a woman of genuine capacity who chose repeatedly and with full awareness to place that capacity in service of a regime built on murder. She was a mother who genuinely loved her children and who killed them because she could not separate her love for them from her commitment to an ideology. She was, among the women of the Nazi elite, the one who was most fully captured by the ideology itself, rather than by the social and personal circumstances that surrounded it. And she was, for all of these reasons, uniquely positioned to demonstrate what totalitarianism actually demands when it is followed to its logical conclusion. The demand is everything, not loyalty, which can coexist with personal reservations, not obedience, which can be rendered while maintaining interior independence. Everything. The surrender of every alternative attachment, every personal consideration, every human relationship to the demands of the ideological project. The other Nazi wives gave the regime much. They gave it their public faces, their social prestige, their silence about what they knew or suspected. They gave it their complicity, but they did not give it everything. They held back, in the end, the most basic thing: the desire to live and to preserve their children's lives. Magda Goebbels held nothing back. This is what makes her unique. This is what makes her story different in kind from the stories of the other women who stood at the center of the Third Reich. And this is why, nearly 80 years after her death, she continues to disturb in a way that the others do not. The others are familiar types. The woman who didn't ask questions, the woman who enjoyed the privileges, the woman who adjusted to changed circumstances. Magda is something else. Magda is what the ideology actually wanted. She is the end point, not the typical case. She is what it looked like when the project completely succeeded in capturing a human being. And the 6 children are what that looks like when it is over. There is a photograph taken in 1938 at the height of the Nazi period, showing Magda Goebbels surrounded by her children at their country estate. She is sitting in a garden chair and the children are arrayed around her in various poses of relaxed childish attention. It is superficially a picture of domestic happiness and prosperity. The sun is shining, the garden is well tended, the children are beautifully dressed. Magda is smiling. It is exactly the kind of image the propaganda ministry would have approved and may indeed have staged. And then you know what you know about where each of those children will be 7 years later and about who will have put them there, and the image becomes something unbearable, a document not of happiness but of what happiness looks like when it is standing on top of an abyss. That is Magda Goebbels. That is the opposite of every other Nazi wife. Not simply more committed or more extreme, but fundamentally different in the nature of what she was committed to and in the price she was willing to pay for that commitment. She was, in the end, the regime's most perfect product, someone who had given it everything, and who had finally, in giving it everything, given it her children. What we are left with, in the historical reckoning, is not simple condemnation, though condemnation is entirely warranted. We are left with something more uncomfortable, the recognition that Magda Goebbels was a human being in every sense, and that the path she walked from a Berlin childhood to that bunker was composed of choices that were made under conditions that are, at some level, comprehensible, not excusable, not inevitable, but comprehensible. And the comprehensibility is the warning. It is the reason her story matters, decades after the last person who knew her personally has died, and the reason it will continue to matter as long as people are capable of surrendering themselves completely to the full certainties of totalitarian ideology. She was gifted, she was loved, and she loved. She was intelligent and capable, and in different circumstances might have made different choices. But she lived in the circumstances she lived in, and she made the choices she made, and at the end of it all, in a concrete bunker under a burning city, she was alone with her children and her absolute certainty, and she made the last and worst of those choices. The children were buried eventually. The regime was destroyed eventually. The world Magda could not imagine living in went on without her, as it had always been going to. And the contrast between her total ending and the continued lives of the other women who had stood near the centre of the same machine remains, even now, one of the most illuminating and most disturbing facts about the nature of the regime they had all served. Well, that's it. We hope you enjoyed our video. If you found this examination of Magda Goebbels and her place among the wives of the Nazi leadership informative and thought-provoking, make sure you check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, where we cover the full range of fates that awaited the women who had stood at the centre of the Third Reich. We also have a detailed video on the children of Nazi leaders and how they grappled with the legacies of their parents in the post-war world. As always, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like today's video, subscribe to the channel as an offering to the gods of the algorithm. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Before we arrive at the final assessment of Magda Goebbels, it is worth revisiting several specific episodes from her life that illustrate with particular clarity the ways in which her character and her choices distinguished her from the other women of the Nazi inner circle. Each of these episodes is a kind of small proof of the larger argument, a demonstration in miniature of the totalizing nature of her commitment. The first is the episode of Karl Hanke. When Magda's husband was conducting his affair with Lida Barova in the late 1930s, Magda had entered into an involvement with Karl Hanke, who was then serving as state secretary in the propaganda ministry. Hanke was a younger man, genuinely devoted to Magda, who at one point proposed that she leave Goebbels and marry him. He offered her a real alternative, a relationship apparently based on genuine personal attachment rather than ideological instrumentality. Magda declined. The reasons she gave to those she confided in centered on her conviction that she couldn't leave Goebbels without leaving her position in the Nazi hierarchy, and that her position in the Nazi hierarchy was something she was unwilling to surrender. She chose the regime over the man. This is a revealing reversal of the more common pattern. Most of the Nazi wives had chosen their men and found the regime attached to them. Magda had chosen the regime and found her man within it. When the two came into conflict, as they did periodically throughout her marriage, the regime consistently won. Hanke, for his part, remained devoted to her at a distance and continued to rise in the Nazi hierarchy. He ended the war as the last appointed Gauleiter of Breslau, where he presided over the city's catastrophic last-ditch defense against Soviet forces, and he was killed in the final weeks of the war, in circumstances that were never entirely clarified. The second episode is the treatment of the Bauer affair more broadly. When Hitler ordered Goebbels to end the relationship and Bauer to leave Germany, Magda did not respond with relief or triumph. She responded with what might be described as cold acknowledgement. She did not reconcile warmly with her husband. She did not express gratitude to Hitler for intervening. She simply continued in the marriage as though the affair were a weather event that had passed, rather than a personal betrayal that had been rectified. This quality of emotional detachment from personal grievance, combined with total engagement with the ideological dimension of her life, was something that struck those who knew her as both impressive and slightly uncanny. She had, in effect, already ceased to invest seriously in the marriage as a personal relationship. What remained was the structural fact of the marriage, and the structural fact was what mattered to her. The third episode is her behaviour during the bombing campaigns of 1943 and 1944, when Allied air raids were reducing German cities, including Berlin itself, to rubble. Magda continued to perform her public role throughout this period. She appeared at functions, gave interviews, maintained the face of Nazi domesticity, even as the material world around her was being physically destroyed. Those who saw her during this period described a woman of remarkable composure, not the composure of someone who had found equanimity in the face of danger, but the composure of someone who had already accepted that the ending was coming and was simply waiting for it to arrive. She had, in a real sense, already died internally. What continued was the performance, carried out with professional precision and the care for her children, which remained genuine, even as everything else had become, for her, essentially theatrical. The fourth episode is her final weeks in the bunker. Multiple witnesses who were present in those weeks have described Magda's demeanour as being distinguished by a quality of purpose that was different from the frantic desperation of many others around her. Some people in the bunker were still, even in the final days of April 1945, constructing scenarios of miraculous rescue or negotiated escape. Goebbels himself, right up to a certain point, maintained the rhetoric of eventual victory or at least of an honourable death that would inspire future generations. Magda had no such narratives. She had one simple plan, and she was executing it with the systematic care she had always brought to whatever she undertook. The children were fed and supervised and kept as calm as possible. She was present for them in a way that the witnesses described as deeply maternal and simultaneously in a way that they found, on reflection, deeply disturbing. She was being the best possible mother she knew how to be, right up to the moment she killed them. This is the paradox that sits at the very centre of her story and that makes it so resistant to any comfortable moral resolution. The love was real. The act was real. They coexisted in the same person, and the ideology that made the act possible did not destroy the love. It simply overrode it at the critical moment, as the lever of a machine overrides the resistance of the material it is working on. There are very few figures in the history of the Third Reich whose stories so completely embody the nature of the ideology itself. Joseph Goebbels is one because his entire career was the practice of total manipulation in service of absolute power. Himmler is another because his career was the practice of systematic extermination organized with bureaucratic precision. But Magda Goebbels illustrates something that neither of these men illustrates quite so clearly. The experience of a person who had fully internalized the ideology, who had made it entirely her own, who was not a functionary implementing it from outside, but a true believer living from within it. And what it looked like from within at the end was exactly what she showed it looked like: certain, calm, and prepared to do anything the ideology required. The women who survived, the Emmy Görings and the Ilse Hesses and the Lina Heydrichs and the Margarete Himmlers, were in varying degrees true believers, and in varying degrees social climbers, and in varying degrees trapped by circumstances they had not fully chosen. They occupy a complicated moral space that historians have examined at length and will continue to examine. They were complicit. They benefited. They did not resist. They looked away when looking away was required and were present when presence was required. Their culpability is real, and their post-war impunity was a failure of justice. But they were also, in the final analysis, human beings who valued their own lives and their children's lives above the ideology they had served. This makes them worse Nazis than Magda Goebbels in the strict ideological sense, and it makes them considerably better human beings in every other sense. The hierarchy of humanity and the hierarchy of ideological commitment are, in this case, the same hierarchy, read in opposite directions. The person who was most fully a Nazi was least fully a human being. The people who were least fully Nazis, who held back something essential for themselves and their children, were more fully human. Magda was the most complete Nazi among the women of the inner circle, and she is therefore the most complete illustration of what the ideology was and what it required. That is her significance in history. That is why she is the opposite of every other Nazi wife. Not because she was more dramatic, or more committed, or more extreme in some superficial sense, but because she was the one who showed us with terrible clarity where the ideology actually led when it was followed without reservation, without hesitation, and without any private self that could resist it. The children are the proof. 6 names beginning with H, 4 girls and 2 boys, the youngest 4 years old. They went to sleep one night in a bunker under Berlin, and their mother stood over them, and the ideology she had chosen to live for became the ideology she chose to die for, and she took them with her. And that was the end. The regime built on hatred ended in a bunker. The ideology that promised a 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. The children it consumed numbered in the millions, and among them were 6 who had names that began with H, who had a mother who loved them and who could not, in the end, love them more than she loved the idea she had placed above everything else in her life. In the long and terrible roster of the victims of National Socialism, these 6 children are a small number. But the intimacy of their deaths, the specific identity of the person who caused them, and the reasons that person gave for what she did, these things make their story a kind of concentrated version of the larger story. A small, exquisite, and unbearable illustration of what the ideology was. Magda Goebbels was born in 1901 in Berlin and died in 1945 in Berlin, in a concrete room underground, in a city that was being destroyed above her, in a regime that was ending around her, in the company of her husband and her beliefs, and the 6 children she had decided could not outlive any of these things. She was 43 years old. She'd been many things in those 43 years, a daughter of complicated circumstances, a student, a wife, a mother, a political convert, a public symbol, a true believer. In the end, she was the clearest illustration the Nazi regime ever produced of what it truly was and what it truly demanded. Every other Nazi wife found a way to stop short of the ideology's full logic. Magda Goebbels followed it all the way to the end. That is why she is the opposite of every other Nazi wife. Not a better woman, not a braver woman, but the one who showed us, without any ambiguity or reservation, what the ideology looked like when it was allowed to complete its work in a single human life. The answer to that question is what you have just heard, and it is one of the most disturbing answers in the history of the 20th century. To place Magda's story in its full historical context, it is valuable to understand the specific social and political world of Berlin in the early 1930s that she entered when she became involved with National Socialism. Berlin in the Weimar years was a city of extraordinary vitality and extraordinary chaos. The economic catastrophe of the hyperinflation years and then the Great Depression had created conditions of genuine desperation for millions of people, and into that desperation, the Nazi movement inserted its simple, powerful, and ultimately catastrophic explanation. Germany's suffering was the result of deliberate sabotage by internal enemies, and the solution was the elimination of those enemies and the reassertion of German national will under strong leadership. The message was not subtle, but it was effective, and it was being delivered by people of genuine charismatic force, Goebbels above all among them in the Berlin context. For someone like Magda, who had the intelligence to see through many of the political arguments being made during this period, and who had the personal sophistication to recognize cheap rhetoric when she encountered it, the attraction to Nazism requires some explanation beyond the simple desperation that drove many less advantaged people into the movement's arms. What Magda found in National Socialism was something more specifically suited to her particular needs. It was the combination of intellectual ambition and emotional certainty, the sense that here was a framework for understanding the world that was both serious enough to engage her intelligence and complete enough to satisfy her hunger for absolute commitment. The movement offered her not just a political program but a total worldview, a sense of historical destiny, a community of the committed, and, through her connection to Goebbels and then to Hitler, a position at the very centre of what she believed was the most significant historical moment of her era. The personal magnetism of Joseph Goebbels, encountered in this context, becomes more comprehensible. He was not physically attractive in conventional terms. He was club-footed, small, sharp-featured, but he was one of the most electrifying public speakers of his generation. A man whose voice and mind could hold thousands in thrall, and in private he was capable of the same intense personal focus on a single individual that he deployed publicly on crowds. When Goebbels turned that focus on Magda, she experienced what many people experienced in his company: the sensation of being truly seen and appreciated by someone of remarkable intellectual force. That this force was entirely in service of a project built on hatred and deception was something that her existing attraction to the ideology prevented her from recognizing as a disqualification. The wedding ceremony in December 1931, attended by Hitler, was a formal statement of the nature of the alliance Magda was entering. She was not simply marrying a man, she was marrying into the movement, into the inner circle, into the project of building the Nazi state. Hitler's presence as a witness was a signal, clear to everyone who understood the Nazi world, that this marriage had the regime's imprimatur and served the regime's interests. Magda understood this perfectly. She had not stumbled into this role, she had sought it. The years of the regime's rise and consolidation, from 1933 to 1939, were in many ways the period of Magda's greatest social power and her most visible public role. She was photographed constantly, appeared in the illustrated press as the embodiment of Nazi domestic ideals, received at official functions, and was present at the major ceremonial occasions of the regime. She travelled with the Goebbels household as it expanded and its official functions multiplied. She met foreign dignitaries who were often surprised by her sophistication and her command of languages. She was, in the assessment of diplomats and journalists who encountered her, not what they expected when they imagined the wife of the Reich Minister of Propaganda. She was not a provincial housewife who had been elevated by her husband's position. She was a woman of the world, comfortable in multiple registers, and unmistakably intelligent. The impression she made on foreign visitors was itself a form of propaganda. People who encountered her and found her charming, cosmopolitan, and apparently reasonable were inclined to think that perhaps the Nazi regime was less extreme than its critics claimed. This was, of course, precisely the impression that both she and the regime wanted to create in the minds of international observers. Magda was, in this sense, one of the regime's most effective soft power instruments, and she was an effective one precisely because she was genuinely what she appeared to be, an intelligent and sophisticated woman who happened to believe absolutely in the ideology she was presenting in its most acceptable form. The relationship between the Goebbels family and the German public during this period was mediated almost entirely through propaganda, as all relationships between the Nazi leadership and the German people were. But the specific propaganda function of the Goebbels family was domestic rather than military or ideological in any direct sense. They were the regime's version of a happy family, the living proof that National Socialism could produce not only national power, but personal fulfillment, not only military victory, but domestic harmony. Magda, as the presiding figure of this household, was essential to this image. She had to be not merely photogenic, but genuinely convincing as the embodiment of an ideal, and she was because the ideal, in her case, was not a performance, but a genuine, if terrible, commitment. As the war years progressed and the reality of what the regime was doing became harder to maintain behind its public image, Magda's role became simultaneously more important and more exhausting. The gap between the public image of domestic Nazi normality and the reality of a regime engaged in industrial murder and losing a catastrophic war widened with every passing month. Maintaining the image required greater and greater expenditure of energy as the foundations under it crumbled. And Magda, who was not unintelligent, who knew more than she publicly acknowledged, who had been told things directly or obliquely that others in her position had managed to avoid hearing, was living with the full weight of that gap in a way that those who were simply performing ignorance did not have to. This knowledge, this awareness of what the regime was and what it was doing, combined with her absolute identification with it, produced the particular psychological configuration of her final years. She was someone who knew exactly what she had committed herself to, who had committed herself to it fully and without reservation, and who was watching it collapse. The psychological pressure of this is difficult to overstate. She was not a person who could find relief in the thought that she had been deceived or hadn't known. She had known. She had chosen. And the thing she had chosen was ending. The health issues she experienced in the final years of the war, including the severe facial neuralgia that required medical treatment, may have been partly a somatic expression of this accumulated psychological pressure. The body, when the mind reaches the limits of what it can process cognitively, sometimes finds its own ways to register catastrophe. Whether or not this is a useful interpretive framework for Magda's physical symptoms, the picture it suggests of a woman living simultaneously at the extreme limits of her physical and psychological endurance in the final years of the war is consistent with what the other evidence shows.